Well, thank you everyone for coming out. This is Amanda Ricker, and she's here to talk about stress response and everything to do with stress and women's wellness. That's a practice she works out of here in Wilmington. She's a nurse practitioner and a certified menopause practitioner. So she's here to teach us something we don't know. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thank you for coming. And this is a subject that has become just inspiring to me to research and to learn more about, because at the onset of doing the work that I do, I really didn't realize how deeply this impacts all aspects of our lives. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to teach you guys a little bit about what is happening in our bodies. So the first part of the presentation is I guess a little bit technical, in that way, just understanding what our bodies are doing and why it's responding the way it is. And I think that that is really helpful, so then we understand what tools we can use and how to utilize this to the best of our benefit. I've put together some papers. We'll fill this out a little bit as we go along, mainly just like a game plan. And on the back, you can take notes, and then we'll talk about that more. I'm gonna set a little timer for myself, just to be sure that I'm moving along, because I like to talk about all this. The first little slide just tells you about me. So I am a nurse practitioner. I'm a certified menopause practitioner. I started my career as a certified nurse midwife, and I think that's where I learned a lot about stress, about the stress of being awake all night long, about the stress of critical situations, and really came to understand my stress response. And then I did recently open a practice called Women's Wellness for Life, which is really focused on women during some of these more vulnerable transitions of hormonal changes. So the purpose, like I said, is that we want to understand what is happening neurologically and endocrine wise. So I think these are both really powerful, because they're different things that can impact our nervous system, and they're different hormonal and endocrine responses that can impact how we feel. And so we really want to look at both of these things together. And then I really want you to be able to walk away with some tools to use to feel like there are some real changes that can impact how you feel and how your body is functioning. So I wanted to start really with just talking about stress. So stress, the official definition, is a situation which disturbs the equilibrium between a living organism and its environment. So what that really means is basically anything that is disruptive is stress. And when I want you guys to think about this, think about it in many different capacities. So our job can create stress, studying for a test can create stress, preparing for this presentation for me created stress, right? So our body responds to lots of different types of stress, even if it's stress that we choose or that we enjoy. And then it's not only how the chemical reaction in our body, but it's also our perception of stress. And so that's going to be really important as we move along. And this also certainly addresses any hospitalization, chronic illness that's not being managed or that is being managed, relationships. So stress really encompasses all of those things. Some symptoms of how stress can manifest in our body. Well, we probably could sit here and list all of these, right? So a lot of these things I think that we know just from living life, but certainly want to bring up concentration, gut symptoms, fidgety, irritable, and then an inefficient metabolism. So oftentimes, I'll have conversations with women about weight loss or weight gain that they weren't anticipating or don't understand why, and stress can certainly be a root cause of that. And then of course it impacts everything. It impacts how we feel about ourselves when we're in a state of chronic stress, and impacts our relationships, impacts our relationship with eating and with food, right? So again, I do a lot of working with women about body image and food choices and those types of things. And certainly sleep, I don't know if it's on there, but certainly stress is going to impact sleep as well. This is kind of a busy slide, but it does tell us all the chronic diseases that we know about. So at the end of the day, we're wondering, why do we really care about this? We care about it because it impacts our health. So we have lots of data to let us know that it's a significant contributor to heart disease, anxiety, depression, anxiety's on the list, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cognitive impairment, and then sleep disorders. And then down below are some of the kind of downhill effects that we can see. So, and one of the things that I would like to point out is delayed health-seeking behaviors. oftentimes we live in such a stressed out life or culture that we oftentimes don't put ourselves first. So it can certainly delay taking care of these things that don't make us feel well. So, like you said, we're going to talk about the nervous system a little bit, because one of the main things that I want to communicate to you guys is that there is an underlying automatic response that your body is having during stress and after stress. So that's one of the things that we want to be able to target. So our central nervous system is made up of our brain and our spinal cord, and goes out to all of our nerves and to all of the organs in our body. Part of the central nervous system is going to be the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic, think automatic. These are things that regulate our heart rate, our respiratory rate, our digestion, things like our sleep pattern, and it is always working. So for example, you look at the sweet little baby, the autonomic nervous system, which is actually not fully developed, these little ones, but I just love the picture, so why not? So even when we are sleeping, our body's autonomic or automatic nervous system is still going. So impacts that we have throughout the day from stressors are going to impact our breathing, digestion, heart rate, sleep cycles, even when we're not under, mechanism that way. The next slide talks about this automatic nervous system is broken down to two parts. And so this is, again, really important to understand when we're talking about stress reduction. The first part is our fight or flight. And even looking at this tiger, I have feelings, okay? I feel a little anxious. I feel like my heart rate could go up. I noticed this has gotten more active as I've gotten older. I went to just a theme park with my children and watched them dangle from high altitudes without a lot of safety harnesses. And I felt my body responding to this, right? So it is an animal instinct within us to go into this place of fight or flight. So we want to understand that our heart rate goes up, our breathing and blood pressure go up, our muscles are tense, and they're tense because they want to move rapidly, but they want to protect. So muscle tension, we can notice increased sweating and temperature dysregulation, which a lot of times I'll see women who feel like they may be perimenopausal or menopausal, but really these significant reactions to stress can mimic a lot of those symptoms. And then also we can see metabolic dysfunction, and we'll talk more about that, but also immune system dysregulation. So when we're in a place of chronic fight or flight, we're going to be more susceptible to a lot of these things. The flip side of that, and I always do this with my hands for whatever reason, like it's a lever, right? So wherever you're stressed, over on this side, we're not stressed, because it is like we can flip the switch. One of these is happening, not both at the same time. So we're either in fight or flight or in rest and digest, okay? There may be different spectrums of those responses, but either our sympathetic nervous system is turned on or it's turned off. So this parasympathetic, which is over on this side with on the side with a cat that is not very threatening, right? Is more of a time of recovery, of rest and digest. So what happens? Heart rate goes down, our blood flow increases. We are now shunting blood to our digestive organs, even our genitalia, right? So we talk about women with decreased libido. Well, if we are in fight or flight, we're not going to get good blood flow to our genitalia at that point in time. We have decreased sensitivity. So again, this plays into all of our organ systems. And then of course, we're going to have a decreased stress hormones. So fight or flight. So what does that mean? There's a fast response and then a slower reaction to fight or flight, and then this chronic stress, which can result in exhaustion. So as we think about this, one of the things that I want you guys to keep in mind is that this fast response and this slow response has a purpose. And oftentimes, stress is really important for us. In fact, it serves us really well. For example, when I'm at work, I'm much more productive if I got a little bit of stress going on, right? So I'm getting things done, I'm talking to people, I'm filling out forms, I'm cleaning my house. So a little bit of stress is beneficial. The problem is when we
go through this phase to the chronic stress. And that we're gonna see that some parameters change in our physiology and our metabolic risk or our risk in general as we progress through the spectrum. So the first is the FAST response. This is put our hand on the stove, pull it back. Like we are gonna have a muscle reaction that's mitigated by adrenaline or epinephrine that happens really quickly. Also at the same time, you have very rapid cellular response. So our heart rate's going up. This also, interestingly enough, impacts our bladder, and I'll get back to that. But our blood pressure is increased, we're increasing glucose in a very expensive way. And so we'll talk about that as well. And there's actually enhanced arousal, which is fascinating to me during this epinephrine piece. But if you go more down to the chronic stress and exhaustion, that's where we're gonna have a blunted sexual response. So again, thinking about how this short bursts of stress or cortisol can be helpful, like focused attention. When we are chronically stressed, we get further and further away from this. The slower response takes minutes versus seconds. So your epinephrine increases, comes down really quickly. After that, what continues their stress response is cortisol, right? So cortisol is typically what we hear about when we think about stress response. So this can stay active in our body for as long as we have received stress, or as long as we have continued, real life exposure to that stress. And at the end of the day, the goal is survival. So again, moving blood flow and energy away from any organ that is not completely vital for survival. And then we look over here to chronic stress and exhaustion. So we continue to secrete these stress hormones. And because we continue to secrete these stress hormones, we have impacts that are not favorable for our body. So we're developing some insulin resistance. We're developing actually a cortisol resistance, meaning that we require higher and higher cortisol levels to stop the output. So again, for example, when we're really stressed out, you may notice our tolerance for any other annoyance goes down, right? So when I'm really stressed out, my kid's whining, which, bothers me in general, is gonna bother me more when I'm really stressed out. So we have a decreased sensitivity to the cortisol. Sexual desire impacts, we're less adaptive. So the longer, it's my mom. This is Oma, she comes across as Santa. She's the only one who can break her mind, do not disturb. So she's not keep calling me. So we see that we become less adaptive. So certain stressors in our life, say like exercising is a stressor, but in a good way, because we build muscle. We do not get better and better at tolerating stress. We only get worse and worse. So we can think about that too for people who have a lot of childhood trauma, grow up in our neighborhoods or our homes. Their stress only continues to they become more and more vulnerable to stressors over this time of chronic exposure. We also see inflammation, which is a huge contributor to chronic disease. We see a blunted dopamine response at the bottom. It's a little bit hard to read, but that blunted dopamine response is more like our feel-good hormone. So there's lots of detrimental impacts, including cycle irregularity. So we can see that too as our menstrual cycles change. All right, here's a little bit about our brain. This is gonna be really quick, but what I really wanted to show you here is that we have. Has anyone used this hand model to show the brain before? So I do this with my kids a lot. So we've got our animal instinct, the amygdala part of our brain, and then we have the frontal, more advanced part of our brain. As we are functioning more in stress, we're utilizing less and less of our thinking part of our brain and more of our emotional or instinctive piece of our brain. And that becomes really important, especially as we get into thinking about the chronic impacts of stress and glucocorticoids on our brain, because we're seeing more cognitive dysfunction, we're seeing more foggy brain and confusion, less ability to think through situations, and over the long course, we can actually look at studies in the brain and see that these neurons are not as healthy because of chronic exposure, and then also seeing impacts like Alzheimer's disease. All right, so the hormonal players, we already talked a little bit about the catecholamines, which is your adrenaline, quick in and out of the body, is going to really focus on increased muscle blood flow, reduce GI motility. Cortisol is the other one here, and so it's secreted by the adrenal gland, right? Adrenal gland. There's a very small therapeutic range, meaning that high levels are no good, low levels are no good. So we really want to be thoughtful about how we stimulate cortisol in our life. Cortisol also helps to store memories and the memory keeping part of our brain. So we may notice, again, impacts on aging there. Cortisol can also stimulate eating patterns or insulin secretion that promotes visceral fat accumulation. And we see that this is chronically elevated with depression and PTSD. So a lot of these things I pull in because I work with menopausal patients who are seeing a lot of these things, such as brain fog, visceral weight gain, sleep disturbance, memory disturbance, and so on. It is important to think about how chronic stress impacts our other hormones. For example, a lot of women will come to me feeling that they have symptoms of thyroid disorder, and they don't have thyroid disorder, although they have all the symptoms. They're probably likely just not utilizing the thyroid hormone. So our thyroid function is actually downregulated. We have a decrease in some of our thyroid hormones itself. Stress is going to inhibit our body's response to producing thyroid hormones. And the reason for that, if you think we're running from a tiger, we don't really need our thyroid to be working, right? Melatonin is the other thing that's significantly impacted by stress. So it's produced again in our brain, and there's a timer. When we have a cortisol burst, typically earlier in the morning, about 12 to 14 hours later, we are having a melatonin burst. And so what we see is that we can have a lot of sleep disruption if we're chronically having cortisol bursts throughout the day. Or if we have a cortisol burst closer towards the end of the day, our body gets really confused. And then the higher cortisol, we're going to have an increased melatonin. The question is when is that cycling pattern really happening? And the last thing we think about is insulin. You know, a lot of people, women specifically with PCOS or overweight or as we age, have insulin resistance. So we know that insulin initially can decrease during the acute stages, but eventually, as we're exposed to chronic stress, what do? We dump out sugar into our bloodstream so that we can move and utilize that. We become insulin resistant, which is basically diabetes, right? So diabetes is where we have increased blood sugars, and our insulin doesn't work as well. So those are things that we really want to think about. And then combined with cortisol, we can inhibit some lipid metabolism. So again, a setup for chronic disease that we want to think about. Gonadotropins are what kind of stimulate our cycles. So for example, our messengers, hormone is a messenger from one organ to another, right? So our messenger to start our cycle or to ovulate can be inhibited with stress, which can lead to menstrual irregularity. Estrogens, stress contributes to lower estrogen in general. Estrogen has a lot of protective benefits from stress. So the better our estrogen is, the less impacts of stress, specifically on our brain. So we have chronically low estrogen levels, we're going to feel more vulnerable to that. So we want to think about chronic stress can cause even more significant depletion of estrogen stores, especially in women who are struggling with that piece. Testosterone, there's not as much data for women, but we do see that it is testosterone decreased with chronic stress. But stress release actually increases testosterone. So we talk about, okay, well, how do we want to mitigate this? Those tools are going to work both ways. Progesterone is a tricky hormone with cortisol. It's actually a precursor to cortisol. So when we are stressed out, we release cortisol and we release progesterone. And we can see that it is helpful as far as a negative feedback for stress response. And that there's probably a purpose that progesterone increases with our cortisol, because progesterone helps to decrease anxiety. The problem with this is because progesterone is used to make cortisol, we can see that chronic exposure can lead to lower progesterone. So we want to think about that too with things like PCOS and menstrual cycle irregularity. So I went through that kind of fast, because not everyone is excited about these things as I am and all the nitty-gritties, but I did want to go through all those components. I do want to talk a little bit about the conundrum of testing. So it is possible to check cortisol levels. Goodness. And the best way to do that is to check to be done with saliva or urinary testing. It's not always as straightforward as just looking at cortisol levels in and of themselves. And the reason for that is because we have receptors within our bodies. So just like I said, when we have lots of estrogen in our body, we're gonna have more receptors to cortisol, meaning we have lower cortisol levels that trigger that feedback loop to impact how long we're stressed out and when we stop. So things like estrogen and progesterone are going to impact the receptors. Sense. The other thing that we think about with the testing is that if you're ever going to test for your cortisol, you want to make sure that you're also testing metabolites. Because if the cortisol level can appear low, we want to make sure, is it really that there's not enough cortisol, or are we just metabolizing it appropriately? So you want to be really thoughtful when you interpret those results. Similarly to hormone testing, is that cortisol testing is going to look at where you are that day. And if you really want to get information about this on paper, then you would want to consider doing it multiple days in a row. And if you're going to look at the cortisol level, by far, other than the total amount of cortisol metabolites, you want to make sure that there's a nice rhythm. And that's important to understand, is that even before we wake up in the morning, our cortisol level is starting to rise. And then it should peak at a couple hours after we wake up, and then slowly go down and be the lowest before we go to bed. So that's one of the main points that I look at if someone's had cortisol testing, is what does that rhythm look like for them? And the last thing is that cortisol levels are very specific for each person. And this goes back to, again, the receptor, the affinity for the receptors. In other words, it's just complicated. So your cortisol level, I may feel great with one cortisol level, and someone else may feel really lousy with that. And so we want to make sure we keep that in mind. So testing is possible, but we want to be thoughtful on who we do it and why we do it. The other thing is that we can often gain a lot of this information by questioning on symptoms. So I don't routinely do this testing because it can be expensive and limitations that we discussed, but oftentimes we know when we're in fight or flight, right? And overwhelmingly, the problem is with elevated cortisol, not with low. So overwhelmingly, that's what we see. All right, here's my lovely picture of a wire. And the reason for this is that oftentimes as I think about stress, I think about it in that kind of picture of that live wire and considering putting in place things that help insulate us from those stressors. So when we think about stress reduction, we can think about it from the angle of, okay, what is causing me stress on the outside that I can eliminate? And then we're thinking about how can I impact my stress response? And so for me, the best thing I think about is this idea of insulation, which we can also think about as resilience, right? So when we think about what can we do to help with this, I'm getting ready to go over several different aspects of research-based, evidence-based intervention. And the good news is that these interventions really work. The hard part is doing them. And so that's part of what our paper is for, is that it's just gonna kind of take a couple minutes to look at, number one, how our body responds to stress, because that looks different for everyone. We'll actually talk about this on another slide. I'm thinking about this. And
We don't, we've had two.
do what?
Two more, one for me, one for me.
Oh, yeah. Yours. Okay. Yes, okay, and this is another thing too, is that the goal is to disrupt that underlying automatic process, right? So when I think about stress reduction strategies, I think about 3 different aspects of this, okay? And so that's what I have on this sheet there for you, which, but the number 1 is to understand personally, how does your body respond to stress? So for me, I'm a big muscle tension in my shoulders. I don't have as much gut issues. I'm a stress eater, and I get really agitated easily. Okay, so that's how stress manifests for me. But other people may have different ways that stress manifests in their own body. A rapid heart rate, difficulty focusing, gut feeling upset. So one of the things is just to think about, how does stress look on you? The next is that we want to think about an intentional plan. Over and over and over, when we look at the data and the research, we know that it's not just as important how we respond in the stressful situation, it's how we respond in that time of recovery. So for example, I used to be an ER nurse, right? I could handle that pretty well, but I was not good at processing that when I was done. And so we know that the processing of that, the resetting of our nervous system even after the stressor is really important. So when we think about the stress in our life that happens on a daily basis, we need daily interventions to reset our stress. So when we think about our strategy, we want to think about something that we can do daily, right? Which is really hard. I know that that's a lot of big ask. The other thing that is going to be important is that when we talk about this idea of outside stressors versus insulating ourselves, and then also recognizing that coping, there's probably a better way to say that, or maladaptive coping. And then we want to integrate it. So this little worksheet is going to talk about how are we going to integrate it, and we're going to integrate it in small ways and slowly, okay, until it's a habit, and then we can build on that. And we've got to recover. So the first thing that is key is to slow down. And I would say, okay, how many people in the room just want to go run 5 miles, which to be stress reliever is easier than slowing down. For me, it's easier. I can go stand on my head for 5 minutes versus sit and be quiet. It's much harder for me. And part of that could be because I'm in fight or flight, right? So if I'm in fight or flight, it's going to be very difficult to slow down. So what we want to think about is, how do we slow down? So saying no, I just would say that this is important potentially to do with a partner or a lover. Because oftentimes we think that we have to say yes to a lot of things that we really do not have to say yes to. Okay, you guys are probably much better experts in this portion of that, but working with a counselor, working with a therapist, really figuring out, why are we saying yes to things, why are we overloaded, and also understanding that this is countercultural. Our culture is going to say more, better, never rest. And so when we think about these strategies, we have to keep in mind that we are literally changing a culture, and I think that we're able to do that, right? And again, kind of bigger things than just a bullet point, like toxic relationships, get in counseling, ask a loved one to look at your list. This is all I feel like I have to do, and just see if you can make room again for that 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes is all I'm asking, and I know that's so big ask. The other thing that we can think about slowing down is breathing. So breathing is really powerful. I kind of wish I had dedicated a whole slide to that, but that's one of the best ways to go from fight or flight to rest and digest. But it is a practice, meaning the same way that I practice to get my arms to be strong or my abs to be strong, I have to practice breathing as a way to reset from fight or flight to rest and digest. The different types of breathing that you can think about, one of them is diaphragmatic breathing. The other one is box breathing, which is really super simple. So box breathing is in for 4 seconds, out for 4 seconds, in for 4 seconds, out for 4 seconds. After you do about 10 repetitions of that, you can switch from your body being in this fight or flight to rest and digest stage. We know that studies show us that we can modestly lower blood pressure and release levels of cortisol. That's why I gave you all those slides before, because we need to understand how detrimental chronic cortisol is to help hopefully motivate us to do something like eating, because we can actually reduce our cortisol levels. We noticed the mental health benefits of this. We can actually reduce blood sugars in people with type 2 diabetes just by doing some of these breathing strategies. Is what? Insulin, cortisol increases glucose in our bloodstream. and it increases insulin resistance. So breathing is a really powerful tool. Progressive muscle relaxation is actually, again, a legit way to help do this. Ooh, I see a typo. And I would use this in labor with, I was laboring with my pre kiddos, but I also would talk my patients through this as they were laboring, because tensing your muscles and progressively relaxing them actually has been shown to have benefit. And then journaling. Journaling is another way to slow down, to process things that are going on. That's why I brought you journals. So that's another way to incorporate that into your day. Okay. Again, these are not to-do lists. This is just to give you lots of ideas so you can grab onto one. I forgot to talk about a superpower. Sleep is my superpower. Okay, so you guys have superpowers as well for how you cope with stress. Some of you may really enjoy exercising or eating healthy foods, hydrating, being with loved ones. So that's the first direction that I would say to go. So if you feel like you're, in a season where you're not coping as well with stress, start with your superpower. Sorry, guys. And usually if we can ratchet that one up, we're gonna have more capacity to do other things to help as well. So that's your little superpower box there. So think about that. Sleep, specifically napping, happens to be my superpower, okay? I used to be really ashamed of this, but now I'm coming out and telling everyone I love a good nap, okay? Because it helps me reset my sympathetic type parasympathetic nervous system. So sleep is a tricky one because oftentimes when our stress levels are interrupted, so is our sleep. And because of that, we know that we have a cortisol burst. We're gonna have a melatonin surge about 12 to 14 hours after. So what helps reset those cycles? Well, stress modification does. So the things that we're talking about are gonna help reset those cycles because it's natural for us, our body wants to have a cortisol burst in the morning. But one of my favorite kind of facts and strategies is that we can also use sunlight to do that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but our eyes are directly, our retinas and our eyes are directly linked to basically a cortisol and melatonin clock that resides in the top of the roof of our mouth. And when we are exposed to sunlight, a specific combination of like reds and yellows on the horizon, it is going to trigger a cortisol burst within our body. And then that's going to help us reset our clock so that we get 12 to 14 hours or melatonin burst. So what does that look like? It looks like being exposed to sunlight around the time of sunrise or when the sun is on the lower part of the horizon for about anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, depending on like the cloud cover and that kind of thing. You're not wearing sunglasses. You're also not staring at the sun. It's just absorbing that scattered light. It's also helpful for things like if you're a shift worker or if you are having jet lag, that kind of thing. So it retrains your body to reset and zone out. Prioritizing sleep also can help. So oftentimes when we're stressed out, what are we doing? We're staying up late to finish projects, or even staying up late just so we have alone time, or getting up early to go work out. But I would say prioritizing sleep can be really powerful. Sleep and stress have a snowball effect, meaning once our stress escalates, our sleep does too. So we want to work on sleep from a preventative avenue. And again, I know this is really, really difficult for a lot of people, and I do a lot more work with sleep and sleep hygiene than just telling my patients to do it. I know that a lot of people have a lot of struggle with sleep. It can be improved with mindfulness, which we'll talk about, and we also want to treat any underlying disorders. So there are other things like restless leg syndrome, again, diabetes, bladder irritability or overactive bladder that can contribute to that. Which, by the way, our bladder responds a lot to stress as well. So we're having a lot of bladder urgency, frequency, that can potentially, because it's a smooth muscle, be contracting or triggered by a stress response. So I've worked with a lot of physical therapists in the area that specifically talk about the stress response of the bladder. Just want to put it out there. All right, so mindfulness. Mindfulness, again, is data-driven, powerful intervention for stress. Mindfulness is learned and it needs to be practiced. So again, this is the concept with these are daily interventions, just like having a healthy diet or sleeping well or exercising. It kind of, some of the concepts of it, although you can informally practice mindfulness, but you think about a body scan, you know, and this is a good point as well, because I think as women, you know, painful periods, heavy bleeding, being pregnant, you've got painful hips and back and breasts and all the things. We've almost trained ourselves to ignore our bodies, right? And then the more we push through that, the more this impacts it. So what I really like about the mindfulness is a body scan, because then you're picking up on, my neck is really tense. I didn't think I was stressed out, but my neck is tense, my shoulders are tense, my back is. So you do almost a non-judgmental body scan. And an awareness of your present time. And sometimes this incorporates gentle yoga as well. And the goal for that is that we can be less reactive and more responsive to some of these chronic stress triggers. The goal, so again, we're resetting. So this all goes hand in hand as we are thinking about going from our reactive brains to our thinking brains. And the other thing that data shows is, so data does show us that we can legitimately switch back to rest and digest, and we're also decreasing inflammation, which is amazing. Data also shows that it's as effective as SSRIs for antidepressants. And that is really powerful. We can actually reduce blood pressure and cortisol, and we can improve our sleep quality. So this is a very powerful tool. It does take a minute to learn how to do it. Movement. I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I will say it is one of the most potent metabolizers of cortisol. So don't overthink it, just move. Okay, you don't have to get a gym membership, you don't have to start, you know, lifting heavy weights or doing yoga. Like, think about what makes sense to you. I'm a walker, I love walking, you know, and it's easy for me to get caught up in all the, I should do this, I should do that. But that is how I metabolize stress, is by walking. And this has huge benefits. It is possible to exercise too much. So oftentimes you can be in fight or flight or in a hyper vigilant place, right? We can shift this and exercise too much, which is going to cause more stress to our bodies. And then of course, yoga. Yoga incorporates breathing techniques and stretching. It's gonna, again, it helps perceive stress, and we can actually measure benefits of that as well. Mindset. These are kind of fun to think about, right? Because I think sometimes we forget that that we have a choice, right? We have a choice about these things. So it's fascinating to read data on laughing because it's fascinating to me. But you actually can suppress some of the bioactive effects of epinephrine and cortisol, like changing things within your body. They actually compared real humor and response to humor and laughing compared to like a yoga laugh, where you like pretend to laugh and you're like,
What?
And you gotta laugh for real, you know. The other is gratitude, and again, lots of data and research on this. It's not just touchy-feely, but it significantly impacts our quality of life and perceived stress. Because it's not just the stress in our life, it's how we perceive it. And then also perspective and reframing. So reframing situations, being involved in community is a good way to practice these things, because people can remind us of that. So again, your goal is just to think of one or two things that you might be able to use to help change things. Here we get more to food and supplements and hydration. I would say, other than food, and well, supplements specifically are meant to supplement a healthy lifestyle. Lots of stress in our culture is lifestyle related. So we want to always move backwards into supplements. I'm just hesitated to put supplements up there because the last thing I want people to think is that you take a supplement and feel better. I think it's a lot deeper work than that. But we know that inflammation is a big trigger for stress and cortisol actually responds in inflammation. So we want to think about avoiding processed foods specifically, and looking at anti-inflammatory diets. For example, like Mediterranean diets or some Asian diets are going to be more anti-inflammatory. Looking at supplements to help with that, and also of course addressing our gut health and hydration. Hydration is a lot of times when people are so completely limited in what they have the ability to change, that is usually one thing we can at least work on. Because we probably are chronically dehydrated unless you make an effort to that. And we're really looking at about 90 ounces of water a day. It is actually stressful for our body to be dehydrated. So it's not all mental stress or perceived stress, it's actually stress for our bodies. And then addressing bad habits. We already talked about saying no, limiting toxic relationships. And then I did put a little thing here at the very end, because we are almost done. And that just kind of check in on your crutches. And so I did encourage you to write down one of your crutches. Like we often have maladaptive stress responses, right? So maybe we're stressed out, we're not sleeping well, so then we start drinking coffee all day long, right? Or perhaps we are doing, and I put a lots of other things. We're really stressed at work because of unreasonable exams or expectations. And so we're drinking alcohol every night. So our crutches become habits. And I think that is well worthwhile considering. And then I did put in here, just avoid steamrolling your body. In other words, we don't want to push through. Our body is telling us something, and we want to listen to it. I've got more about this maladaptive coping. I think one of the reasons I felt led to put this on here is because I've seen the alcohol creep in my patients, looking at COVID and COVID response, emotional numbing, Netflix, scrolling. Sometimes we just gotta stop scrolling, and then we're gonna have our 20 minutes.
Go get some Jimmy's.
Binge eating, too stressed to rest, hypervigilance or procrastination. Again, this is not a judgment. It is just a brainstorm of tools that might be helpful. And then I do encourage community support. So we talked about stress today, right? But there are other significant causes of stress or escalation of stress. And so we really want to encourage you just to get help with trauma or abuse, anxiety or depression, substance abuse, and grief. These are all things that really need to work hand in hand with the medical provider, counseling, more support system than just trying to mitigate chronic stress. And that's it. I will give, before I do questions, I will talk about, I just happened to be launching this 21-day reset.
Yes.
And that lined up really well with this talk. So this is, I'm affiliated with a ministry called Revelation Wellness, and it is using basically fitness and health and wellness to spread the gospel. And so they have a lot of content, and as a because I've been trained by them, I have accessibility to a lot of this content. And one of the things that they do is the Stress Relief Project. So it actually has two components. One component is 20 minutes a day that is virtual and self-led. So you sign up, in your in-basket, you get daily content, which is you read through a devotion, you learn about stress response in your body, and then you practice about 5 to 6 minutes of mindfulness that's biblically based. So I'm really excited to do that because I want to build my skills. And I'm actually doing that with a group of women, November 1st to the 21st. So we're all doing it, but it's virtual and self-led, if that makes sense. And then there's a retreat that's coming up on November the 11th for women who are participating in this, or even if you're not participating in this. That's at Peaceful Pastures, where we're going to do yoga, we're going to do the content for that day, and just meet other women in the community. It's a beautiful location. Just being there is a stress reducer. So that's coming up here. Actually, moving on to speed. All right, I did a lot of talking. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you guys may have.
So I'm postpartum, and I feel like trying to navigate the weight loss situation afterwards. Obviously, there's a lot of stress that comes with it all.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the lower belly, some lower, visceral fat, yeah.
Yeah.
What exactly? What should be my first route of tackling that, I guess.
So I would say it's difficult if you're still breastfeeding.
I'm weaning down. We're weaning down.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, because when you're postpartum, you're more estrogen deficient. And estrogen deficiency contributes to some of that visceral weight gain. And so one of the things that's working against you as you're doing that is you kind of stored weight differently because of your pregnancy to utilize that.
Right.
Some women lose a lot of weight when they're breastfeeding, but a lot of women do not. They will not lose that weight till they stop. So the core values I talk about, other than hormones, but sleep, stress modification, gut health, and then fuel and nutrition, as well as hydration. I mean, there's a lot of different things, and then shifting that metabolism. So there's not like a quick fix.
Right.
But what I would say is that there's likely a hormonal component, and I think you're not even gonna know what that is until you're done breastfeeding. But that's when you work on all this other. So, and then of course checking thyroid. A lot of women have thyroid disorders.
Mine are good.
Postpartum.
I have to check mine very regularly.
Okay.
Yeah. Thyroid.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So. Cool. And, yeah.
I feel like I had so many things that were just so good.
The, like what you advised in the presentation, would that help? Lessen the need for like, so I had hysterectomy, so would that help lessen the need for hormones? I'm not taking hormones yet, I was contemplating bioidentical. So they give me hormone for like, topical, and for dryness, whatever, but I have this fear. So I am a nurse, I wasn't a nurse, that was like years ago.
Okay,
So like,
yeah.
I've got some knowledge of all
Sure,
that, but.
yeah.
But so this is like personal, a lot of new things have come about since I've been in that area,
Yes,
so,
yeah.
I don't know what their recommendations are.
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I believe every woman deserves a conversation about risks and benefits of hormone. So I think that at least that is a conversation to be had, that takes more than 15 minutes, right, honestly. And like with your provider. So if you're feeling like you're having a 3-minute conversation about risks and benefits of hormone therapy, that is, you deserve more. I would say that you have multiple tools that you use to feel better. Some women do feel better with just doing lifestyle interventions and changes, and some women don't. So at the end of the day, it comes down to quality of life. So if you are trying these things and you're not feeling better, especially if you're developing more kind of maladaptive behaviors, okay? So say you're like just unable to sleep, and you're doing some of these things, and they're more because this wasn't geared towards menopause. There are other things potentially that you can do to help other than just stress modification. But I always think about that. So because there are looking at weight gain, looking at the impacts on cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis. So it is kind of like a weighing of the risks and benefits for that. So that kind of like a non-specific kind of answer.
And I
Yes, it can help. This absolutely.
yeah, so I already started feeling a good difference change from working on my mental health, so.
Yes, absolutely.
I actually feel like I have less pain in my joints and,
Yes.
like I'm relieving a lot of other
Yes.
symptoms I have.
Yeah.
So I just was talking to my girlfriend, I was like, I'm gonna start walking and so kind of for I came here, but then, I don't know, the spot brain or whatever, I'm like, where's my journal? Like, I just had to find my journal, and then I found that, and then I was like, so, all right, something every day, so tomorrow I'm gonna get on that horse.
Yeah,
That's right,
no,
do that.
that's great. That's great. Yeah, and gut health is significantly important, especially in inflammation wise. And that's what we see because estrogen and progesterone are anti-inflammatory. So when your numbers go down, you have more inflammation in that. So gut health is another tool. And that's my whole goal is to say, like, you got tools, it just depends which ones you want to yield and what makes the most sense for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The person on the chat was asking, can you send us the slides to share with them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. That way we can get that.
Yep.
Questions? What is something that you do, maybe for yourself to kind of help with like the food nutrition? Cause I feel like that's always such a hard one, and especially when you are on the go, like I know for me, I think slowing down.
Yes.
And just when I make meals, obviously I try to make bulk of
Yeah.
like if I make dinner on Monday, make enough to have lunch at
Yes.
least the next
Yeah, yeah.
day, stuff like that. But I guess as far as like being able to choose healthier options, is there like a, you know, like a little trick or
I mean,
something that you got?
Do you think what got me on this stress journey is that I realized so much of my food and nutrition choices were made because of stress?
Sure.
So again, you know, I think that that's huge. I mean, I do think that, you know, having a pattern of eating that makes sense to you, and preparing ahead of time is really helpful. I don't know, I guess it's, you know, and I think for me, it was so complex because I am such an emotional eater as well. And not like a plug for Revolution Wellness, but the core study that I do with them is about food. And it's about how do we, you know, live the kind of life that we want to live, make healthy choices. And it really is just putting it all before, you know, but all before God and making it God's plan for us, because I don't feel like He meant for us to live in a place where we're constantly guided by food, whether we're restricting or obsessing or neglecting. So that kind of set me free from that, and that's why I love leading those groups.
Yeah.
Because I think they do kind of set free from that and then looking at food as fuel.
Yeah.
And then once I shifted that perspective to looking at food as fuel, that's where I felt empowered to really be able to eat what made me feel good. Right. I mean, it's not perfect, you know, and it's not
Like
perfect.
gummy bears and cup.
I know, but a lot of times that's what happens, right? So I think it's working on stress mitigation, you'll kind of figure out some of the strategies. So what do? I think that the most research is with the Mediterranean diet. So I try to do that as much as I can. Plus I love the food, it's really easy for me. So I try to get like, you know, high protein grains. I try to get lots of healthy proteins like fish or chicken. And I'll do all the grains. I'll do like fish or chicken and prepare that at the beginning of the week. And whenever I'm chopping up veggies, I just double or triple. So if I'm cutting them up for dinner, like I'm having a ton because I work from home. So I'm eating what is right here at home. So that makes a big difference for me.
Yeah.
I also do intermittent fasting. I think there's benefit for intermittent fasting. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of all this. Very good.
More questions?
Okay,
Yeah. I have a little journal. If you go into start journaling.